What's up everybody? Welcome to Mascota. Today we're going to continue with the fork rebuild. We're going to first separate the two forks, drain them, and then start cleaning them one by one and essentially breaking them down to upgrade the internals. So let's check it out. Okay, so first on the list, let's separate the two forks just so we can work with things a little easier. So we're going to focus on the left fork first. We'll put the right one off to the side. A little bit of this just in case it leaks. Okay. Alright, so we have the left fork over here. Just gonna let that down a little just so we're not getting fork oil everywhere. Okay, as you can see, the fork's pretty dirty. One interesting thing that I found that is actually going to be a little bit of a delay is this piece here. So we have this little piston that fit in there. The brake caliper is actually mounted to this. Now, on either side of this pin as it sits in there are these rubber dust seals. One of them, as you can see, has been cracked and is like super dry. The other one is just completely disintegrated. It actually just fell apart in my hand. So I'll need to replace both of these. I just happen to have one from the parts pack that's actually still in pretty good condition. And I've ordered another one, which we'll wait for to arrive. And then we have these little pins, which I'm going to reuse, just need to clean them. They essentially keep the rubber seals in place. Either way, that's all stuff that just needs to be cleaned. Now, as far as the fork goes, we're going to drain it first. To do that, we're just going to pull the bolt out from the bottom and let it pour out, or as much as we can from the bottom. If the bottom is empty and nothing's coming out, then we're going to open up the top and pour the stuff out of there, and hopefully we won't make that much of a mess. So let's start by pulling out the bottom and draining the bottom part. Okay, so we got the bolt. We'll wipe that down. I'll let this drain. Perhaps we should open it on top. Okay, so while that's draining from the bottom, I'm going to start opening the top. Key point about opening the top, it's spring loaded. So do keep your hand in the way. There we go. Because it will fly off and potentially hit you in the head, like some people have experienced before. Okay, so we have that. We have the spacer, which looks in pretty good condition, and then we have the spring back in there. So spring. Yep. Let's wipe that down. Oh, there's a washer on top, so make sure not to forget that. Okay, now that we have the internals out, we'll continue to disassemble by pulling the fork seal or the dust seal off, and then the internals from there. Now before we do that, before I invert this guy, wipe off some of this oil that I spilled just so it doesn't go everywhere. And this will need a thorough cleaning. Okay, so to get this guy off, flathead or an X-Acto knife should do it. Since in this case we're replacing it, doesn't really matter if we damage it, but usually you'd want to be a little more careful with this, not to cut too much into it. Oh man, there's oil everywhere. Keep in mind guys, this is a messy job. Okay, fork seal is off. There we go. This one actually not too bad of a condition. A little gunky stuff on the inside, but we'll compare it to the new one later on. Wipe off more of this oil. Okay, so now what we have here is still leaking oil. Okay, so next is a little plastic shield, which we'll also need to clean. And then we have the metal clip, or the snap ring in there that we need to take out. Oh shit, flip it this way so I can squeeze that. So, just to show you guys what's actually in there. I don't know if you can see it, but there's a snap ring. So, let me just get that out. Okay, with the right tools, comes out very easy. With the wrong tools, it takes hours. Okay, and then now the last part is taking out the oil seal and essentially pulling the whole thing apart. The way to do that is you literally just tug. Now, given that I have oil everywhere, there we go. So once you pull it apart, it all comes apart. Okay, so after taking the whole thing apart and making a massive mess everywhere, this is what it actually looks like. So on the bottom side of it, or rather on the inside of the tube, you have this piston, with the rebound spring and these little springs and gizmos and gadgets that keep it essentially in place. On top of that, or rather on the outside of it, on the tube itself, once it's been inserted into the slider, you have this bush, what looks like a spacer or another kind of bushing, the oil seal, a snap ring that keeps everything in place. So pretty much this snap ring and the bolt at the bottom that bolts onto this are what keep the whole thing together. And then above the snap ring you have a little plastic washer, and then the dust seal, then the spring goes inside. On top of the spring we have a metal washer, spacer to preload the spring, the cap, and another plastic cap on top of that. Pretty straightforward. Most forks, standard forks for any bike really, are more or less assembled the same way. So now that we have it apart, let's take a look at taking off this little bit here, which is specific to the Sabre. This is the TRAC system, or the anti-dive system. So this little gizmo here has essentially channels of fluid to go through it, and depending on this setting it enables more or less. And what I'm guessing it does is it actuates this little piston here, which pushes this piston which sits in it, which essentially shifts the front left caliper slightly forward or back as you apply the brakes to kind of prevent dipping in the fork rapidly. So either way, let's disassemble that, then we're going to clean everything and reassemble back with the new components. Okay, I took the TRAC assembly as well off. All it was under it is a spring that sat in here that kind of fits into that hole there. So as hydraulic fluid pressure builds up through this, it flows into this chamber, and depending on the setting, this thing pushes up onto the little piston, squeezing harder or softer onto the mounting bolt or the piston for the front brake. So that's pretty much it. Alright, the assembly's done. Let's clean this stuff up, because this is disgusting. It has this like yellow residue everywhere. Some really old stickers on it. So I'm going to try to polish that up. But other than that, other than, you know, 30-80-year-old scuffs here and there, the fork tube's actually look in good condition. There isn't too much scoring or marking. No cracking, which is great. So we should be able to rebuild this just fine. So that's it. Let's do that. Alright, so after a little bit of elbow grease, the fork sleeve or slider is clean, degreased for the most part. I mean, as much as I can clean it actually. There is still a little bit of this yellow residue everywhere, but, or most places, whatever. Also dings and scratches. But it cleaned up pretty nice. What I used was just a bunch of toothbrushes, simple dish scotch thing, sponge, and some cleaner and WD cleaner, WD-40 cleaner and degreaser. The anti-dive TRAC piece also cleaned up quite nicely. I mean, it still is quite gunky and stuff, but honestly it's fine as is. So let's put that back on, and then we can start putting some of the things back together. Alright, next on the list is the piston at the bottom of the fork. Let's assemble that and put it back into the main tube. so that we can start to assemble the fork back together. So we have the rebound spring, and then everything else goes on afterwards. So that goes in. There you go. So I'll just shake it through. Comes out. Now for the rest of the components on the end, we have first a little locking ring that needs to go on. The tricky bit is to get it past the first, or the second locking groove, because there's another ring that goes in it. Okay, so there we go, that is in there. Then next we have a washer that anchors against it, a spring, another spring washer type thing that goes against it, and then there's another locking ring at the end. And this is what it looks like when it's all on there. So we have this little spring actuated thing, and the entire rod won't go out of here. Okay, so now that that's done, we're ready to put it back on the fork and attach it with the bolt at the bottom, which shouldn't be too tight either. Now this bolt does have a crush washer, which seems fine, so we're going to reuse it. One thing we want to do before we get this thing into the slider is try to clean off the tube itself. So for that, I'm just going to use some paper towel. Now this is a little tricky because there are all these dings on the pipe itself that could potentially scratch the new O-rings, so we're going to have to try to get past them somehow. Okay, well, let's clean this up first a little more, and then we're going to try to put it on there. Alright, have the tube in there. I put the bolt in on the bottom. Obviously I can't tighten it right now, but it does hold things in place so the fork won't come out. And now we can start putting in the rest of the components. So first we have this big bush, which needs to be essentially rammed into place. In order to do that, let's see if this will work. Okay, so I just pushed it in place with this guy. What this is just a 1.5 to 1.25 inch rubber PVC fitting. So really, literally what I just did with it is put it on, line it up with the hole, and then I just pressed it a bit harder and the bush went in place. Fits perfectly on a 37mm fork, and now that's nice and smooth. Okay, next we have this little guy who is going the sharp way up. Gotta make sure it sits in there properly. Okay. Then next is the new fork seal. Now, in terms of the fork seals, oh come on. The stuff that I got from All Balls Racing. So this is the new seal, this is the old one. So they are slightly different, and as you can see, this is the way up, so that's the way this thing needs to go. The bottom is this side. So the new one looks slightly different, but it looks like it should be able to seal pretty good. So let's get that on there. Now, to make this a little easier to slide on there, we want to put on some either rubber grease, or in this case I'm just going to put some fork oil on it. Just the edge, just to make it slide on a little easier. Now the fork tube does have a little bit of scuffing on it, which is not good, and you want to try to protect against that as much as possible, so try to lubricate as much as possible. Alright, so after 2 hours of struggling to bed the new seal in, I have finally done so for the most part. Now what I did was my pipe fitting, I clamped it on and I left the old fork seal on top of it to use it as a driver. And essentially just pretty much take it and just, yeah, ram it in there. So now that it's in there, let's put the snap ring on. Alright, after a long battle with the fork seal setting and the making enough room for the locking clip, or circlip, it's finally in. Now it's just a matter of measuring things out and assembling the rest of it. At this time we're just going to put this aside and look at something else, which is the the spring differences. So let me clean this up. This is the old spring, as you can see. Now the difference here is that the new one is actually shorter. So the progressive suspension one, you can see it's more wound up at the bottom, less wound up at the top, but it's almost quite a bit. So that's almost an inch. Actually, let me measure that to see the exact difference. So that's about 30.4 millimeters, 30.5 millimeters. So roughly the distance I had actually offset the forks into the triple trees. So this will actually come into play when we're mounting things back on. It's just something to keep in mind, because the resulting forks will actually end up being shorter than the originals. So let's add that back in. Close the top so that we can tighten the bottom bolt. Then we'll open it up, add fork fluid or fork oil, and then we're gonna close it back up, tighten everything to spec, and the left fork tube or the left fork should be done. So let's do that. Alright, so let's fill this fork up. A few things to keep in mind. The fork is opened up, there's nothing in it. The manual says that for the left fork we need 390 cc's of fork oil. Now the progressive suspension instructions state that one should not have more than 140 millimeters from the top of the fork tube down. So the level of the oil should be below that. So what we're going to do is we're going to pour in according to the manual. Then we're going to measure, and if that's too much, we'll pour some out. If it's too little, we'll leave it at that. Okay. Ooh, this is blue. Okay, so we want 390 cc's. I'd say that's about it. Okay, now let's pour that in here. Okay, now that's interesting because the fork tube is full to the rim pretty much. So, let me double check something. I believe the measurement should be done with the fork tube extended. Okay, so that's in there. Now we need 140 millimeters. 140 millimeters is 14 centimeters. So that's quite a bit more than this, which sounds really strange. So, yeah, that's 14 centimeters. That's way too much. So that should be like down to here. Let's pour some of that out. I guess either this thing's not right, or that's way too much. I mean, it did say yeah, 390 fluid ounces, cc's. Okay, well, let's pour some of that out. We got quite a bit went out. So we pulled up just under 100 cc's. And, okay, so that's a little too little, so we need to add back a little. Maybe about this much. That's too much. Ugh, this will be a little game. Okay, that's 14 millimeters. Okay, so now we put the fork, the spring back in. The manual says that it doesn't really matter which way you put it in. People are saying that it helps with a little bit of spring noise if you put the more wound way downwards. So let's do that. Let's see if this thing will overflow. Okay. We're going to replace the washer with a new one. Good. Get that on there. I'll check the torque specs on that later on. And we have the cap. Okay. Okay, this fork is done. Doesn't seem to be leaking oil, or at least I don't see any blue liquid anywhere. Seals seem to be holding up. Yeah. Well, this one's done. Now to do the other one. Alright, right side fork is fully disassembled. Now a few interesting things to point out. Seems like the dust seal on this one had fully failed, or there was water in there before it was put on, because the clip ring or snap ring is almost completely rusted, and by extension the dust seal, or not the oil seal, was actually covered in rust. The other difference that I noticed from the other fork is that the bushing on this one that sits on top of the slider bushing or spacer, whatever it is actually almost completely flat. So that should probably mean that it's a little easier to install. But then you can kind of see what's going on in here. There's lots of rust residue and oil, so I'll need to clean that up. Oh, there's actually another bushing from the bottom, which I'm guessing is fitting like that. Yeah, more than likely. Okay, so now to just clean all this up again, try to reassemble. Hopefully in this case the new seals would actually play out much better. And I think I'll try to polish this guy up, but I might just use the snap ring that I have from the old bike to mount things. So let's see how it goes. Okay, the fork seal is in on this side as well. I just want to show you guys my contraption to ram it in. So essentially I'm using the plastic washer as a flat surface, just so it distributes the force evenly. Then a thick roll of electric tape, and then my rubber pipe fitting, just to kind of support the tape a little extra so it doesn't slide back. And then instead of just ramming this into the other one, that didn't do much. What I did instead is flip it upside down and then just bang it like this. So essentially just ram it into the floor this way, or not the floor, but rather a cushioned spot. So now everything seems to be nice and in. So let's put in the snap ring that I have from the old bike, which is in much better condition than this one. Little scuffs here and there, but for the most part it's a snap ring. It works. So let's put that in, get this stuff off, and finish assembling this. Everything is assembled, fork is functioning, nice and smooth. Now let's tighten the bolt on the bottom, the drain bolt, and fill it up with the proper amount of oil. Drop the spring in, close the top, and this is done. Okay, forks are fully assembled with the new progressive suspension springs, the all balls seal and dust, oil and dust seals. The only thing missing is this little piece for the anti-dive track system. The reason I haven't installed it is, like I mentioned before, I need another one of these dust seals. So I'm waiting for that. Until then, the fork will remain off the bike. Hopefully I get it soonish, and then we can install it back on there. As for the fine-tuning of the whole system, we'll leave that until we're on the bike. We still don't have air in the suspension. Also, the track system is currently set to 1. When I took it off, it was on 4, so we will play around with all that. One thing to mention here is that the length of the forks has been reduced now. Because the springs are shorter, the overall length and I believe the travel in particular have been reduced, but because they're progressive springs, the lack of travel is made up by a stronger spring. So right now, if we measure, we're looking at, I mean, this is not a very exact measure, but we've lost about, let's say, 16 millimeters in travel. So we'll need to take that into consideration when we set up the final positioning and offset of the forks. Speaking of which, let's take a look at how that's going to play out into our geometry simulation tool. I actually have a new version that's almost ready to go, so let's check that out. Okay, so here is the next version of the geometry tool. A few things that I've changed. One, I made the screen a lot bigger, so it fits whatever screen you're using. I did some improvements to the graphics, so it's not choppy and stuff, and most importantly, shifted a few things around. So now we actually have the computed fork length, the fork triple trees, and the settings are a little bit reorganized. So coming back to our saber over here, this is the stock form of it. So the total length of the forks is 890 millimeters, and we have a 40 millimeter offset, meaning that they are through the triple trees for 40 millimeters. That's the reason for that is that the old handlebars, they actually mount above the top yoke. So we need to change this. Now that we've installed the progressive springs, the forks are actually shorter, and we'll have to see how much shorter once we mount it on the bike, but for now let's say that the 16 millimeters that I measured on the bench is indeed the size. So reducing this to 74, 73, there we go, that's the closest. So that effectively reduces our fork length to 833 because of the offset, and already that's dropped our trail down and our wheelbase. Now with the previous setup, my plan was to drop the forks another 30 millimeters through the triple trees. So that would move our offset up to 70. So if we do that, we're now down to about 4.1 106 millimeters of trail, 28 degrees of rake, 1547 degrees of millimeters of wheelbase. Okay, and now if we do the tire changes that I was also planning to do, so make the front tire an 80, well, 110 80 18, and make the rear tire a 140 80 17. We're down to just below 100 millimeters of, so 99 millimeters of trail with 47 millimeters of wheelbase and 27.7 degrees of rake. Now our fork length has also been reduced to 803 millimeters. Now that I look at this, I also know that the travel of the fork has been reduced essentially because I cut the springs. Or I didn't cut the springs, but I changed the springs out with the shorter ones. So that 16 millimeters is taken out of the total travel. So the total travel for the Saber was 140 millimeters. So if we reduce that by 16, so that leaves us with 124. So if we reduce that fork length by another 124, so we're at 174 by 124, that puts us at 750 exactly. So 750. So again, we're in that 2.8. Now, mind you, we are running with stiffer springs or progressive springs, which should be a little bit stiffer. So these conditions wouldn't be happening as often. But if we wanted to kind of fix that a little, let's move the offset back a little. So move the forks down through the triple trees, let's say another 10 millimeters. Let's pop that back up just so it's at 3 inches, so 76 millimeters, 1500 millimeter wheelbase. So that puts our offset at 53 millimeters. So only dropping another 13 millimeters. And if we think about it, technically with the old setup, I had dropped the forks about 32 millimeters. The forks are now 16 millimeters shorter, and we're dropping them 13 millimeters. So that's roughly 29 millimeters. So that's roughly the same setup as before in terms of the overall system. So that's actually not bad. Now if we bring the forks back up to their full extension, so 174, we're at 102 millimeters of trail, 1555 millimeters of wheelbase, 820 millimeters of fork length. I think these dimensions should be pretty good to use. But that all remains to be confirmed once we get things on the bike, measure things out again, and see how it goes from there. Either way, okay, so that's pretty much it for this episode. Make sure to subscribe, hit the little bell for notifications when new videos become available. Follow me on Instagram at DocOnMoto2018, and make sure to check out DocOnMoto.com, where the new version of the suspension tool will be available very soon. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.